for ADB, and ASEAN+3 Macroeconomic Research Office, or AMRO. My name is Glenn Van Zutphen, and I will moderate today's session. Today's webinar will focus on several themes crucial to the future economic recovery in the ASEAN+3 region amidst pandemic scarring. There will be particular focus on regional and country-level sectoral growth drivers. We will also be highlighting two new publications: the ADB's Supporting Post-COVID-19 Economic Recovery in Southeast Asia, and AMRO's ASEAN+3 Regional Economic Outlook 2022, ASEAN+3 Growth Strategy in the Pandemic's Wake. We'll start off presentations from Marte Inohalas. She is AMRO's economist and co-author of the thematic chapter in this year's ASEAN+3 Regional Economic Outlook entitled ASEAN+3 Growth Strategy in the Pandemic's Wake. Then James Villafuerte, the ADB senior economist, will present a new ADB report entitled Supporting Post-Economic COVID-19 Economic Recovery in Southeast Asia. Later, we'll be joined virtually by Byung-Sik Jung, the Deputy Director General of the International Finance Bureau from the Ministry of Economy and Finance in Korea. Also, Ton Tang Tran, the Director of the Department of Industrial Forecast and Enterprise Department from the National Center for Socioeconomic Information and Forecast, that's also known as the NCIF, based in Hanoi. Lele Song will also join us, the ADB Director of Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department, and Ling Hui Tan, AMRO's Group Head and Lead Economist for Regional Surveillance. They will all join us for a panel discussion a little while later. Now, if you have any questions, we would certainly recommend them and welcome them today. Please do type them into the Q&A window, and we will be happy to look at those and answer those a little bit later in the session today. For now, though, let's get started with opening remarks from AMRO's Director, Toshinori Doi. Doi-san, please.
Thank you, Glenn. Good afternoon from Singapore, and welcome to today's joint AMRO-ADB webinar. This is our first joint event, and I look forward to more to come. This webinar is organized as a side event of the 25th ASEAN+3 Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting, which was held yesterday under the chairmanship of Cambodia and China. At the meeting, Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors from 10 ASEAN member states and from China, Japan, and Korea gathered to discuss macroeconomic challenges and deepening financial cooperation in the region. More than 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, economic recovery is beginning to gain momentum in the ASEAN+3 region. Growth is expected to be robust. However, legacy and new risks continue to cloud the outlook. The possibility of new and more virulent COVID-19 variants, which could derail further economic reopening, cannot be ignored. More recently, the war in Ukraine has driven up prices of energy and major agricultural commodity prices and worsened supply chain bottlenecks. If prolonged, it could amplify existing risks. A more aggressive move by the Fed could trigger a sharp repricing of risk assets and volatility in global financial markets, including capital outflows from the region. These external headwinds are expected to impact consumption, exchange rates, and the current account balances in the region. In the joint statement, ASEAN+ ministers and governors recognize that continuing to provide supportive policies to alleviate the impact of the pandemic and sustaining recovery remains crucial. They acknowledge the importance of avoiding misallocation of resources and ensuring support for new and growing sectors. ASEAN+3 ministers and governors also stressed the importance of closer intra-regional cooperation. For example, in the area of trade and investment, supply chain logistics and resilience, and digital integration, and securing post-pandemic growth. Accordingly, today's webinar to discuss new drivers of growth is a follow-up on the conversation among the ministers and governors. COVID-19 is both a major disruptor and a catalyst for change. The scarring effects from the pandemic on labor, capital, and productivity may have cast a shadow on long-term growth. But the pandemic has also spurred innovation in sectors such as retail, finance, and healthcare, which might lift the region's economies in the long run toward higher productivity-driven growth. Shortly, we will discuss several themes critical to economic recovery in the ASEAN+3 region amid pandemic scarring, with a focus on regional and country-level sectoral growth drivers. The webinar will touch on well-established sectors, including garment, tourism, and agro-processing, and their trajectory in a post-pandemic world, along with industries that have emerged with high potential for future growth, such as electronics and digital trade. So what policies can help strengthen the business environment, improve infrastructure, and crowd in private sector participation to support growth? And what role can regional cooperation play to build back better, greener, and more resilient ASEAN+3 region post-pandemic? In the next few hours, you will hear directly from the experts from AMRO and ADB, as well as policymakers in the region. Thank you.
Director Doi, thank you very much for your opening remarks. I do appreciate it. Now let's have our first presentation. It's going to come from Marte Inohalas. Hello, Marte.
Thank you, Glenn. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in today's webinar. My presentation will be on the ASEAN+3 growth strategy in the pandemic's wake. And again, this is a chapter of a flagship report that we launched last month. Part of what we do in AMRO is that every year for our report, we will look closely at structural challenges to the ASEAN+3 growth strategy. So in the past few years, we looked at the key elements of the region's growth. But of course, for this year, we chose to focus on the COVID-19 pandemic. As Director Doi said, it has been a major disruptor, but at the same time, a catalyst for change. So we've asked ourselves if our previous assessment of the region's strong prospects are still valid and reflect on what the pandemic means for the region's growth strategy moving forward. In the presentation, I'll be focusing on two questions. The first one, has the pandemic damaged the region's growth potential? Followed by, will it change the role of services as a driver of the region's future growth? I will end with a few key takeaways for the ASEAN+3 as it embarks on its post-pandemic growth phase. And the first question, has it damaged our growth potential? In a report, we say that the longer the pandemic drags on, the higher the likelihood of scarring. By scarring, simply put, we mean by the extent with which the pandemic has pushed down the future growth trajectory compared to what it would have been if the crisis did not take place. As you can see here, ASEAN+3 is comprised of a diverse set of economies, and they have all been affected differently. So some have already recovered, some beginning to recover, but as we're still on the lookout for new subvariants, clearly the health crisis is not yet over. Let me walk you through some of the mechanisms through which this scarring could occur. In our report, we'll look at three main channels. That's on the labor supply, capital stock, as well as total productivity. The scarring on the labor force will happen because COVID has intensified already declining birth rates. It could also discourage future immigration because of the border closures. Labor force participation rates have fallen while unemployment rates have risen. On the other hand, some of our members do not have these demographic challenges, but they run the risk of scarring also on labor productivity because of extended school closures and their lower capacity for remote schooling. In terms of the scarring of the capital stock and productivity, We expect this to happen because debt levels have increased in some economies. There is a risk of rising number of zombie firms because of too generous or too long support. And more importantly, there has also been a massive loss of fiscal space, which will be very problematic for those that have large and urgent infrastructure needs. Just to get into a little bit more detail, which economies will be affected by scarring on the labor supply front? Of course, that would be our aging economies, as birth rates continue to decline, as you can see on the left, as people postpone parenthood plans. In the middle, labor force participation rates have also declined. If you just focus on the red dots, especially on the economies to the left, they're all negative. How long this decline would last will depend on how the pandemic has changed individual decisions to enter or join the labor force. If the drop is because of the younger workers, this could just be a temporary discouraged worker effect. But if the drop is because of older people turning to early retirement, then this decline would be more permanent. Lastly, on the slide onto the right, you see how prolonged border closures have kept many foreign workers out of our economies, and whether they will return will depend on opportunities still available to them in the host economies, and of course, lingering perceptions on migrant labor. If we now move on to scarring in human capital and productivity, this will be felt mostly, we believe, in middle and lower income economies. The pandemic, as we know, has caused a massive disruption in schooling. And the left chart, the red bars indicate the number of school closure days. And as previous ADB study actually said that the number of lost instructional days in the ASEAN+3 is at least 20% higher than the global average. The chart you see here on the right is an indicator of learning losses because of COVID-19, and that could be because of the number of school closure days, as well as the effectiveness of remote schooling. The key and simplest takeaway from this chart is that those that experience the largest learning losses, like Myanmar, LA, Lao PDR, KH, Cambodia, these are the economies that can afford it the least. The good side is on the ground, we do hear that a lot of our youth are acquiring digital skills, so that should provide some offset to future human capital. Now turning on to capital stock scarring. This would affect, we believe, mostly our emerging market economies in the ASEAN+3. That's because pandemic support has consumed a lot of fiscal space, and that could have been used for public investment. If you look at the left, the public-private partnership commitments have actually fallen sharply. The risk here is that there's a delay in capital formation, especially in infrastructure, and that could occur in economies that actually need it the most with the largest infrastructure gaps. And they are the ones that are highlighted in this right chart. In the medium run, investment could further go down because of deteriorating dynamics in debt, as well as the need to rebuild fiscal policy space. Additionally, we feel that investment could also suffer and receive more scars if there is a significant weakening in corporate balance sheets, especially when support finally ends. What this means is this can discourage our companies to invest or borrow, and that will be a negative to business dynamism and innovation. In fact, many of our firms actually entered the pandemic with strong balance sheets, if you see here on the left chart, but many economies also provided support as the pandemic dragged on. So as a consequence, corporate bankruptcies highlighted here in the right did not actually spike compared to pre-pandemic levels. But the thing is, we don't know how this is going to evolve yet. A risk that we in AMRO is looking at is that prolonged forbearance is going to give rise to a lot of zombie firms, allow them to survive, and that would just drag on future growth in the long run. So after this slide, let me move on to the next question, which is, has COVID-19 dimmed the potential of the services sector as an engine of growth? On the downside, as we all know, travel and tourism has been decimated. Our inbound tourist arrivals in the ASEAN+3, as in the left chart, has contracted to the tune of at least 80% on average in the last 2 years. The recovery of the sector, we believe, will be very slow without the return of the Chinese tourists. And as you can see in the right, survey evidence suggests that their return will be most likely be very gradual, and so will be the recovery in all our lost tourism earnings. So we believe in our report, and we've written this there, is that tourism policy strategies that focus on rebuilding traveler confidence, especially starting at the domestic level, would be a good buffer in the meantime. How do we do this? It's basically enticing local residents to travel more through discounted packages, marketing support, marketing or ecotourism, adventure tourism, and that should provide an upside to the sector. On the bright side, the pandemic has also boosted growth in some sectors. Doi-san has mentioned this earlier. Digitally supplied services were able to grow massively in COVID-19, and at the forefront of that, of course, is e-commerce. In the left chart, the e-commerce retail sales of our major ASEAN economies have actually expanded by 50% in the past 2 years, and we expect this to even grow further. In short, our outlook for e-commerce is actually very positive and strong. So it's a strong candidate as a new growth driver. As you can see here in the right chart, this is because it has become a way of life for many Southeast Asian consumers. That's due to the high internet absorption in the region, and of course, the ease with which we were able to integrate e-commerce in our daily lives. Of course, apart from e-commerce, we've also identified digital financial payments as well as telemedicine as two other potential growth drivers. Digital financial payments, one, are boosting e-commerce. The left chart here highlights how a lot of merchants are looking to increase their use of digital payments because they're cheaper to process, safer, as well as more convenient. So a lot of our central bankers are already leaning into this trend by, for example, setting standards and determining license allocations. To compare, growth in the telemedicine space is still at the early stages, but there's strong potential for growth that we're seeing. If you look at the right chart, the venture capital investment in the sector in the first half of 2021 alone has already surpassed the entirety of investments in 2020. So there's strong underlying demand there, and we believe there needs to be more support on areas like data protection, upgrading our healthcare professionals in the use of digital tech, as well as investing in ICT in the health sector to take advantage of this growth. Thirdly, the pandemic also highlighted the role of modern services. So whether these are services that do not require the buyer and the seller to be close to each other. So those in the Philippines would be familiar with this. These are the BPOs, professional services, creatives, and accounting. Modern services actually benefited two economies in the region, as you can see in the left, that's the Philippines and Singapore. But elsewhere in the region, there are still those who rely heavily on traditional exports of services like travel and tourism. During the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic, modern services, the green line at the right, actually fared much more stronger than traditional services of travel, which was performing way below its pre-pandemic trend, the pink line. So what this means is this highlights the role of modern service exports in diversifying service offerings in the face of continued headwinds. But of course, for the region to take advantage of that, we need to upgrade our IT professionals, as well as think about new growth areas like consulting in the green finance, as well as in the climate change space. I've talked about almost 4 sectors that are new growth drivers. But of course, to take advantage of that, we believe the region really needs to double down on strengthening interregional links. And this is where RCEP, we believe, will come in. We expect the RCEP to be creating new trade as well as investment opportunities, promote supply chains in the region, and help us discover new sources of income. If I can just quickly summarize the key areas of the agreement in three categories. The first one would, of course, be tariff reductions on the bulk of the goods. The second one you see here is efficiency gains from a consolidated set of trade rules, more accommodating rules of origin. And what this means is that our exporters are able to take advantage of the unique characteristics of different production bases in the ASEAN+3, all tariff-free. And thirdly, of course, is the boost to cross-border services trade. We look at the right side because of the agreement's provisions on labor mobility, as well as e-commerce and digital trade. So the e-commerce and digital trade in particular are critical, we believe, because all of us are trying to find new growth drivers in this post-pandemic, more digitized world. Let me summarize my presentation in three broad statements. As the pandemic drags on, we believe scarring is going to happen. It will take different forms in the ASEAN+3. Scarring in the labor force will happen in our aging economies. And the capital stock front, scars will happen in emerging economies where the fiscal space is very narrow and there's a lot of debt that can constrain future public investment. And thirdly, scarring on the productivity front will happen because we've had extended school closures and the risk of zombie firms will delay the reallocation of resources. In terms of sectors, travel and tourism will definitely take time to recover, but on the bright side, digitally powered services should help us achieve a higher productivity-driven growth, as Doi-san mentioned in his opening remarks. But of course, for us to take advantage of all these promising and potential growth drivers, ASEAN+3 must strengthen their intra-regional links and think about that as of utmost importance. Let me end here and thank you for listening.
Marta, thank you so much for your view from AMRO. We appreciate it today. And let's head over now to James Villafuerte for the ADB's view of what's happening in his presentation. James, over to you.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm really happy to be here and to be doing this joint ADB AMRO webinar, as mentioned by Director Toshinori Doi. I look forward to working with AMRO during these years and the years to come. For today, first slide, please. For today, I will be talking about the first of the 4 reports that were prepared by ADB in 2021 to help assist countries in preparing economic recovery that could take place in the post-COVID-19 world. Next slide. So as a background to this study, as we all know, COVID-19 has scaled back years of socioeconomic gains across the globe, and Asian economies were actually no exception. If you look at this slide, the first impact on the region has been so many people has been pushed out of unemployment and into extreme poverty. Rising income inequality and issues in terms of education and healthcare access have also been noted, with some segments of the population having more means to work, study, and get medical attention during the pandemic. Because of these issues, what we've seen in the region is the massive rise in need for priority spending on social protection just to protect our people. At the same time, global and regional headwinds arising from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the tightening global conditions are also putting pressures on prices, inflation, and supply chains. And this makes economic recovery a little bit messier. For instance, rising prices of oil, food staples, and industrial metals are actually a burden for most of our economies. There is also the issue of the era of low interest rate, which seems to be ending soon. The worry in the region is that this could expose ASEAN+3 economies to volatile exchange rate fluctuations, disruptive capital flows, and financial instability. And last but not the least, we know that the fiscal space in the region continued to shrink, with revenues expected to fall down with declining growth, while spending on priority spending continued to rise. These are the reasons why we need to review the growth drivers that could help our economy generate more business, employment, income, growth, and revenue. So as a background, these are the 4 studies that were generated under the policy advice for COVID economic recovery by the ADB. The focus countries are mostly ASEAN economies. And the purpose of the first study, which is entitled Supporting Post-COVID-19 Economic Recovery in Southeast Asia, is to really identify the sectoral growth drivers that could support this economic recovery. And how did we do this? To do this, we basically focused on 3 criteria. One is we look at the sectors in terms of its size, its contribution to GDP, the share of GDP contribution, its contribution to employment, both during the pre-pandemic period. We also examined the COVID-19 impact on these different sectors. And last but not the least, we look at sectoral competitive advantage. Based on this criteria, we've established or identified 5 sectors which are critical to growth. And they are namely tourism, that's one, agro-processing is next, electronics and digital trade, and then we have garments. And then for each of these sectors, what the ADB study did was to look at the structural challenges that were existing even prior to COVID. We also look at major shifts during the COVID period, and these helped us formulate policy actions. So let me discuss the first sector that was selected was tourism. As Marty mentioned, the impact on tourist arrivals in 2020 to 2021 ranged from 80% decline in Cambodia, 83% decline in Thailand, and 84% decline, for example, in the Philippines. And a big story here is that even prior to COVID, tourism sector has also been struggling with a number of issues. One, there's the issue of poor infrastructure. There is also the issue of the very low average spend by tourists in the region. Much of the workers in the tourism sector are also low skilled, and there are lots of informal business supporting the industry. And as Marty mentioned, there are indications that the pandemic could lead to a fundamental slowdown or decline in long-haul tourism. This is an issue that has been exacerbated because of the adoption of digital tools for meetings and events. And for example, for ADB and AMRO, now we are actually, most of our meetings are still online. And if there are physical meetings, it's still hybrid. Therefore, to rebuild the industry, the report focused on a few policy recommendations. It is essential that governments in the region work together to restore tourism demand through strong marketing and information campaigns. They have to also to focus to make travel safer with clear health and entry protocols. The region also need to offer more diversified tourism destination, which could make tourism more sustainable. Investing in better paid and more skilled workers will also contribute to a high growth and sustainable growth for this region. And because tourism is actually affected by health outbreaks, a stronger crisis management response could actually help build industry resilience. Next slide, please. The next sector that we focused on is really agro-processing. And for Southeast Asia, agro-processing contributes around or generates around 130 billion of gross value added in terms of GDP, which is equivalent to about 4.6%. And it also employs around 8 to 9 million jobs, which is around 2.5% of the region's labor force. Again, similar to the story in the tourism sector, even before the pandemic, the sector faces a number of challenges, comprising of inconsistent supply of raw materials due to adverse weather conditions, outbreaks of diseases, like for example, the swine flu disease that decimated our supply of pork and also created some issues with prices, fluctuations in global market prices and exchange rate, limitations in terms of cultivation of areas, There's also a lot of food waste because of the lack of storage, transport, and distribution policies. Last but not the least, there is lack of access to formal market. We also noted in our study that the agro-processing industry is highly labor intensive and relies very much on simple and rudimentary processing methods. It has very low adoption of automation and technology. And last but not the least, access to finance, the availability of skills training facility are quite limited. For example, in terms of finance for Thailand, only 40% of Thai agro-processing firms have access to credit. There is also the issue of environmental sustainability in agro-processing. As I said earlier, the industry contributes to food loss and waste generation across the value chain. And lately, there's also been a shift in terms of consumer demands preferring more environmentally sustainable products. So what are the policy actions to make this sector contribute more to growth? One is really harmonizing food standards within the region, creating more transparent and efficient supply chains, adopting technology and improving processes to enhance product quality. And there is also the important need of streamlining and simplifying regulations, forming effective partnerships, and also providing strong agro-processing ecosystem can also help in this action initiative. Next slide, please. The third sector that we've looked at is electronics. And as we all know, electronics is very important for Southeast Asia. Aside from Singapore and Malaysia, the Philippines and Thailand are big players in the electronic sector. And more recently, Cambodia and Myanmar are also joining, although coming from a small base. For example, in the Philippines, electronics comprise of about 53% of its export. In Thailand, electronics comprise around 16% of their export. Again, we noticed many structural challenges besetting the industry. This includes the narrow diversification across electronic supply chain. For example, if you look at the upstream industry, 40% of their input sources are coming from China, Hong Kong, and Taipei. And this introduces some vulnerability. In terms of export destination, 5 export markets account for about 68% of their total exports. Again, providing some vulnerability to the region. The region's participation in the electronic supply chain is also in the low value added products and processes, mostly the assembly of and testing. And we are trying to move into the higher value added, which comprise of research and development and product design. One concern with the electronic industry is actually the rapid and disruptive technology adoption, which could actually have a negative employment impact. As an ADB study suggested that approximately a quarter of the jobs in the electronic sector is at risk of displacement with the adoption of 4IR technology. Last but not the least, there are also rapid change in consumer trends, and obsolescence is also an issue. So in the study, 2 policy areas have been identified to raise the dynamism of this sector. The first one is really related to technology upgrading, especially for special economic zones. In this regard, I think China and Malaysia are actually ahead. They have actually developed digital special economic zones to really support the growth of electronics. The other aspect actually is in terms of providing greater incentive for research and development, and also investing in training facilities to develop the skills and human capital. And I would add a third one, which is actually the importance of strengthening institutions to improve the coordination between local business, international firms, and governments. Because as we all know, in this new age, we need more effective partnership to really address all these challenges mentioned below. Let me now go into the, can you go back the previous slide, into the digital trade? As what Marty mentioned, the digital economy is a new area for growth in the region. The digital trade offers a very high growth potential for Southeast Asia. For example, in Indonesia, digital trade represents the 11th largest sector, accounting for over 1.2% of their exports. In the Philippines, it represents an even larger share of exports, being the 6th largest export sector, accounting for about 5.4% of exports. Much of the region's digital trade now concentrates on information technology, business process outsourcing, and software development, although digital marketplaces like e-commerce have been recently picking up. There are considerable opportunities to drive digital trade in Southeast Asia, and Marty has mentioned many of them. In Cambodia, for example, opportunities related to data analysis and document processes are beginning to evolve. In the Philippines, e-commerce export is relatively small, but we think that they could actually expand. As demand for digital products and services grows, we think it is important to really enhance the digital connectivity in the region. The region should also invest in logistics and distribution facilities, because even though these are digital flows, they also interface with the physical distribution of goods and services. In particular, developing an IT BPO roadmap for those in this segment are quite important. We also need to support skills development and training. And I think one of the most important is also to rethink the regulation to protect consumers, particularly in terms of identity as well as cyber security. Now, let me go back to the last sector, which is garments. I think with the boom in e-commerce, upgrading the garment sector, which is a significant employer of female workers, is very critical. Presently, the sector faces many challenges related to low value-added products like low value-added t-shirts, labor-intensive t-shirts. The concentration of supply base is also makes the supply chain also quite vulnerable. There are also poor infrastructure in relation to energy. And for example, in Yangon, firms actually experience 3 to 4 outages a day. And the concern also on increasing wages in the region, which makes this sector less competitive relative to other countries. There is also the concern on environmental damage. The industry continues to contribute to the erosion of forest. They add to freshwater and water pollution, and also air pollution for some countries. Therefore, improving competitiveness in the study, we suggest improving competitiveness of the garment sector through simplified business regulations, faster digital technology adoption, stronger research and development, probably a greater focus on culture-related garments. Like, for example, you would notice Lele and myself, Lele is wearing a bula shirt, no, which is also similar to what I'm wearing. Is like a more modern batik shirt. Skills training and also establishing more flexible production and business models could also help support the industry's growth. Let me end here and thank you for your attention.
James, thank you very much for that. Much appreciate your presentation so far. And we are going to start in on our panel discussion now. We've got a lot of topics to discuss. We see your questions coming in on the Q&A box. Thank you very much for those. Keep them coming. We'll get to some of those a little bit later in the program today before we finish off. But first, let's talk specifically about Korea and Vietnam, and let's bring into our discussion Byung-sik and Ton Tang. The question for both of you is going to be looking at our pandemic situation 2 years after. What are the key constraints to growth that your government is facing, and what is your strategy to reinvigorate that growth in your country. So perhaps first we can go to you, Byung-sik, in Korea, and tell us about what that looks like for you.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for inviting me to share our ideas about this topic. I really appreciate the AMRO's and ADB's excellent presentation, especially Matt's presentation captures many important themes, and also James captured very important specific sectors and policy suggestions. My comments might be a bit different from your study, but it would be helpful for you to understand what's going on in Korea. As Martin's presentation indicated very well, Korea has very minimum negative impact from the pandemic. We implemented a very drastic policy response to handle this pandemic. Therefore, we have a very small negative impact. And Korea has experienced only, as I mentioned earlier, very slight negative growth in 2020 compared to the major countries, and has grown 4% in 2021. However, as a result of the ongoing pandemic and the recent external environment, three major challenges to growth have been highlighted. Let me share these with you. The first challenge is rapid inflation. The consumer prices surged due to the sharp decrease in the supply of a commodity following the Russia-Ukraine war, along with the prolonged expansionary monetary policy and global supply chain disruptions since the pandemic. As a result, it is likely to deepen polarization of wealth because of the surge in asset prices, reduce real purchasing power of households and business, and leave scars on the economy. The second challenge is increase in household debt. In particular, the rise in real estate prices in a lower interest rate environment played a major role in the increase of household debt, which might lead to a contraction in private consumption and negatively affect on the soundness of financial system. The third and final challenge is increase the burden on small business owners. As in the presentation by AMRO and ADB, social distancing measures in Korea also led to the downturn in service industries such as restaurants, travel, and tourism. The impact was concentrated on small business owners. Going forward, I would like to introduce three strategies in addressing the aforementioned challenges. First of all, the strategy to stabilize inflationary pressure. In addition to normalizing monetary policy by rate hikes, we are trying our best to develop and implement measures to stabilize supply and demand and prices of important items such as commodities and foods. Second, the strategy to manage household debt. Basically, we'll make our effort to stabilize the real estate market. Together, we plan to make lending practices take root based on repayment ability, induce repayment in installments, and support the financially vulnerable. Last, the strategy to support the recovery of small business owners. To this end, we will support small business owners to truly overcome the pandemic through full damage support, including loss compensation, financial support, and easing the management cost. We also plan to strengthen digital and online support for small business owners to boost their competitiveness. Regarding the travel and tourism industries, likewise, ADB already suggested, we will support the industries by holding festivals and fairs as well as other marketing efforts, and developing tourism programs based on the new trend. Meanwhile, in order to achieve sustainable growth, we need to maintain growth momentum by enhancing the vitality of the private sector and securing future growth drivers such as decarbonization and digitalization, as well as addressing the immediate challenges. To this end, we will conduct overall regulatory. To this end, we will aim to emphasize the following the policies. We will conduct overall regulatory reform and shift away the principles of economic policies from governmental support, including fiscal injection, toward enhancing economic vitality centered on the private sector, the market, and business. Along with this, to respond to rapid environmental changes, such as decarbonization and digitalizations, we will support the traditional manufacturing industries to value-added ones by adopting new technologies, as well as foster industry like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, batteries, healthcare, for them to become future growth drivers. For the small and medium-sized companies and ventures to become a major player in the economy, we also plan to establish a fairer market order, create an innovative venture ecosystem, and facilitate the financing for the ventures. Let me stop here. Thank you. Bye-bye. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Byung-Sek, for that. And if we can go over now to the view from Vietnam. Ton Chang, how do you look at the reinvigoration of growth in the economy from government's perspective?
Yeah, thank you. And I think you got quite a good lesson from Korea. Thank you for the presentation from Mr. Gang. For the case of Vietnam, I think a lot of story actually. Vietnam suffered the COVID in 2020. It's quite unusual. We just got about only 1 month of social distancing, and it doesn't much affect to the people living. However, it got the external effect from the supply side, the supply disruption, particularly from China and some other countries. So it affects the Vietnamese industrial growth, and also it makes our GDP growth just reduced to almost 3% from the on average level of around 6%. It's quite significant. So the same case happened for the 2021 when the global economy recovered a bit, but also in from 2021, Vietnam suffered a lot from because of the number of COVID cases increased significantly. But fortunately, also last year is also the year where the vaccinated available is much better than for the a year before. So it also make Vietnam can have a better strategy. But even that, we got the negative GDP growth in the third quarter of 2021, and it's make the overall picture of the economic growth just we got about 2.5%. It's much reduces. So I think the strategy of Vietnamese government to cope with and to recover from the COVID is quite different. We have somehow we have a similar approach with international experiences, including the monetary policy and fiscal policies, but it sometimes depends on the number of cases of COVID. And I think the most important instrument that Vietnam applies is that we soon open the economy once we got the high ratio of vaccination. We soon open the economy, and we also facilitate push up the export. That's one of key driver of our economy. So actually, for last year, 2021, the export ratio of Vietnam even much higher, even double the ratio of the export growth is even double than a year before. You got almost 20% of export growth. That's very much help the Vietnamese economy to recover. The lesson from Vietnam for the a bit medium term and long term policy instrument is that we have a package of supporting and recovering the economy. In 2020, we got about almost 3% of GDP for that kind of supporting program. For the 2020, 22 and 23, we intended to provide about 15 billion US dollar for such recovery program. Just focus on the infrastructure improvement, and very large proportion of that focus on the connectivity construction to improve the connectivity of the countries. And we also focus on digitalize of the industry production, and that's very much expected to support the recovery in the long terms. And I think for the lessons of Vietnam is quite, in terms of the, if you listing the instruments that the government issues, is more or less similar, and what other country apply is also applied in Vietnam. But what I want to emphasize for the lesson of Vietnam is the agile or the timely supporting or the timely recovery action is very important. And in that sense, Vietnamese government a bit slower than what we already decide. For example, for the supporting the people who are vulnerable with the COVID program, we just can reimburse about for the 1/6 of the total plan budget. The problem is the complicated in the administration procedure that Vietnam apply. Even for investment or for recurrent expenditure, it's a bit just hinder the recovery of Vietnam in the long term, and people worry very much about that situation, and they also concerned about implementing the recovery program in 2 years from now and up to 2023, and that's a very much concern. However, so far until now, we think believe that the Vietnamese economy can be recovered very soon. In our forecast, we can get about 6.1 or 6.2%. It's more or less similar with the before COVID, and most of the long-term driver of the economic growth will be recovered, particularly for the labor, because the labor mobility is now almost the same with the situation before the COVID. And because of the labor intensive economy, we do not have a much effect for the case of long term. But for capital and for some other issue, it's also it is a problem. And in our program, we also addressing that kind of thing. For example, the interlinkage or the infrastructure or the digitalized, that's some hard infrastructure. That's our program addressing, and only the question is how soon or how timely our program will be implemented, and that's the big question so far. Okay.
All right, thank you, Tuan Tang. Of course, getting people healthy, making sure exports are going again, and then that huge investment in infrastructure sounds like a very interesting way forward for Vietnam. So thank you. We'll be keeping an eye on that. Let's go now to Linh Huy. And Linh Huy, in AMRO's report, you mentioned that one of the biggest concerns was the loss of a fiscal space that could be used for public investment in the ASEAN+3 region. How should regional policymakers go about rebuilding that fiscal space? following the pandemic, and also responding to the urgent investment needs, and there are many of them in their economies, such as those required for digitalization, among many other topics.
Thanks, James. James, why am I calling you James? Glenn. Yeah, you're right. In the thematic chapter of our report, we did look at the potential scarring effects of the pandemic on the labor supply, on capital stock and productivity, and Marty just took us through that. In terms of scarring of the capital stock, the biggest concern for ASEAN emerging and developing economies is, as you mentioned, the fact that the pandemic support and stimulus packages of the past 2+ years have consumed a lot of fiscal resources, and these could have been used for public investment. To be sure, most ASEAN+3 economies had significantly more fiscal space entering this pandemic than they did in previous crises. And overall, on average, public investment in the region has not declined during the pandemic, but post-pandemic, public investment could be squeezed by the need to rebuild fiscal policy buffers. In fact, as we've just heard, much of the region is now emerging from the pandemic, reopening the economies and looking for a recovery of growth. So the first step for rebuilding fiscal space will be to unwind the emergency support measures that were put in place during the pandemic. How and when to unwind these measures will depend on the recovery momentum in the economy and the need for continued support. Obviously, as economic growth picks up, the fiscal deficit should start to improve as automatic stabilizers kick in. But obviously also, we can't just depend on automatic stabilizers. The support measures that were introduced during the pandemic will have to be withdrawn at some point. This has to be carefully calibrated. As we all know, COVID isn't exactly eliminated yet. And there are also new risks and uncertainties stemming, for example, from the war in Ukraine and high global inflation, to name a few. If support is withdrawn too soon, we risk jeopardizing the economic recovery. So most economies should pare down their support measures gradually and selectively based on an assessment of need, and probably also be prepared to put them back if the situation warrants. And I think we heard some of this from the policymakers as well just a minute ago. Once the recovery is entrenched, the next step would be to make a strong commitment to fiscal consolidation. Governments would need to prepare a clear fiscal adjustment plan with specific fiscal targets and then quantify the discretionary measures to achieve these targets. This is essential to maintain market confidence. Of course, the specific adjustments will vary with individual economy circumstances. So for example, some economies may need to put more emphasis on revenue enhancement as part of their fiscal consolidation. And they can do this by improving revenue collection capacity first, for example, before they start introducing new taxes or raising tax rates. On the expenditure side, we should avoid across-the-board fiscal austerity, as we have learned. Instead, a comprehensive expenditure review would help to rebalance spending priorities to ensure that there is adequate support for vulnerable groups and for long-term development priorities like education, health, and infrastructure. Again, as we just heard, that's also the plan on the horizon anyway for Vietnam. And over the medium term, fiscal structural reforms would be necessary for more large-scale resource rebalancing to incorporate new policy initiatives such as digitalization and green initiatives. So I'll stop here.
Ling Hui, thank you very much. Yes, lots of priorities out there for every government to look at right now. So certainly not an easy time to make those decisions. Thanks, Ling Hui. Let's go now to Lele Song. Lele, the ADB report and the presentation talked about 5 different sectors that can contribute to growth and economic recovery. Do you agree with that, those 5 sectors? And are there other sectors that you think may be important as well? And how can those sectors help address the economic scarring that Marta talked about in her first presentation? Your thoughts on that, Lele?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Glenn. And first, let me thank the organizers inviting me to participate in this very interesting webinar. And also, this is, I think Director Doi said at the beginning, this is the first ADB AMRO joint webinar. And I was involved in AMRO actually in the early days. And this is a belated congratulations to the 10th year anniversary. I think they celebrated the 10th year anniversary in November last year. And in early days, I knew a lot of AMRO colleagues. Some of them are still working AMRO. So I'm very lucky. And also in 2016, actually, I accompanied the former ADB president, Nakao, visited AMRO. That's 2016. That was the first official visit by ADB president to AMRO. So thank you very much. And I'm very glad to be in this webinar and to discuss with our AMRO colleagues and also see our former colleagues to present the study. So Martha came from ADB and worked in ADB a long time ago, 14 years ago. So that's a really long time ago. Okay, so thank you very much first. And so let me also congratulate our colleagues at Southeast Asia Department for the launching of this report. This report is extremely important. I encourage participants to read the report. The report has a very detailed analysis of those sectors identified and actionable policy advices for countries to take in order to recover fully and also better than before the pandemic. And AMRO's report, as usual, they always produce a really high quality macroeconomic report about ASEAN+3. And these 2 reports complement each other very well. Yeah, because the AMRO report talks about a big picture, macro picture particularly, also touching on key sectors. And ADB reports focus on 5 sectoral analysis. So you do have a macro picture and you do have a micro picture complementing each other. And the previous speakers, policymakers, they also gave a very broad view and policy makers' perspective about ASEAN+3, how they recover from the pandemic. So from my side, probably I couldn't add much more to their very nice and excellent analysis. So let me touch on a few points. So ASEAN+3 actually responded very well to the pandemic. And as our colleagues from Vietnam correctly pointed out, and they did take timely reactions. So ASEAN+3 had a very good response to the pandemic, and I believe they will recover very nicely and very quickly from the pandemic. Although we've already know now it's like a perfect storm coming. So many countries are still emerging from the pandemic, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine has added such a crisis and worries. And you look at the food prices surging rapidly, and the fertilizer prices are also rising rapidly. And Russia and Ukraine, these 2 countries are the major producers and exporters of fertilizers. And ASEAN+3 economies, their agriculture actually depend on fertilizers. And the fertilizer is also a major inputs of agriculture imports. So this is also an immediate concern to ASEAN+3 economies. I think policymakers definitely look at them very closely and respond accordingly. I think our AMRO colleagues have already touched on this very clearly. But let me highlight one point which ADB really takes that into our heart. So that's we need to look beyond the short to medium term, look into the long term. And we always said climate change is an existential crisis facing human beings, facing human societies. And we also say the war against the climate change would be one the battle against the climate change would be won in Asia, because Asia accounts the bulk of the carbon emission in recent years. So this is the battle in the long term, not only in the long term, but also in the short term. And I think our previous speakers, they have already touched on this point. And climate change actions, ASEAN+3 economies, they need to do a lot of actions to slow down the pace of climate change and to adapt to the impact of the climate change. And this climate change actions can provide new growth drivers. This is a huge challenge to ASEAN+3 economies, but also it provides opportunities for all economies to catch up, to invest. And I believe the world will invest in climate change actions significantly. It's already invested a lot in the past few years, including ASEAN+3, but it will continue to invest. And ASEAN+3 needs to catch up. I think there's a lot of work to be done in ASEAN+3 economies, particularly in ASEAN countries. And because along with climate change, you have this digital revolution. So I would say we have two revolutions ongoing at the moment. You have a digital revolution, which two publications touch on, and you have this green revolution, green technology revolution, which the technology will be utilized against climate change. So I just pause here, and I can elaborate more in the second round. So thank you very much, Glenn. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Lele. Appreciate that. Great comments and insights there. Let's talk now a little bit about the ongoing war in Ukraine. What's that doing to some prices? We've got the discussion around global and regional headwinds next, facing the ASEAN+3 region, from supply disruptions due to COVID-19 to the war in Ukraine, pushing oil and commodity prices. We've talked a little bit about that already today. And pushing those global interest rates upwards as well. What are your top line thoughts about these particular risks, and what are your governments doing to face those risks as well? Byung-sik, let's go to you first and find out what's happening in Korea.
Thank you so much. I thought that I'm a second author, but thank you so much for your inviting me as a first presenter. Global inflation remains at a unprecedentedly high level due to, as you mentioned, that first monetary normalization, supply chain disruptions, and Russian and Ukraine war. Global inflationary pressure is likely to continue for the time being, as AMRO and ADB projected it. Korea is no exception. Rapid inflation not only causes macroeconomic instability, but it can also have an impact on the public's economic livelihoods by limiting private consumption. As a result, the Korean government is putting forth a variety of efforts with the price stability as its top priority. First, it is a monetary policy. In terms of a monetary policy, Korea is curtailing the liquidity supplied during the pandemic through a key rate cut. We raised the key rate 4 times from August 2021, a total of 1 percentage point to ease financial imbalances and stabilize the prices. Considering the fact that members unanimously agreed on the necessity of additional rate hike to stabilize the prices at April Monetary Policy Board of Korea, and fast widening internal external rate gap as the US Fed made a big step to rate hike by 50 basis point, along with announcing the quantitative tightening plan in May FOMC. There are rising expectations that Bank of Korea will raise the key rate in the near future, which will gradually ease inflationary pressure. Meanwhile, with the household and corporate debt levels are high, an increase in interest rates may increase the interest burden and limit consumption capacity. As a result, we are promoting additional measures to reduce interest rate burdens, such as expanding policy financing and providing support to small businesses seeking ultra-low rate financing, along with keeping household debt at a reasonable level. Second, it is fiscal policy. To boost the economy during the pandemic, Korea has expanded its government expenditure through several supplementary budgets, and it is expected to form another supplementary budget in the near future. In the short term, there are concerns that a sharp increase in government expenditure could adversely affect price stabilization. However, as AMRO panelist Ling Hui pointed out, fiscal policy plays an important role in protecting the vulnerable, particularly in offsetting the impact of exit strategies. To avoid the negative effects of excessive government spending and to ensure sustainable finance, we are working to ensure fiscal soundness by promoting the implementation of fiscal rules, improving expenditure efficiency, and strengthening the performance evaluation system for fiscal policies. Third, it is a micro policy. On the micro side, we are trying to alleviate the supply-demand imbalances that have caused the recent rise in prices and to ease the prices felt by the people. Concerning recent sharp increases in oil prices, we have increased the supply by releasing stockpiled oil for the first time in 10 years, as well as reduced oil-related taxes and subsidies. In order to stabilize the prices of commodity and livestock and fishery products, we implement measures such as adjustment of quota tariffs and securing international grain imports. In the future, we intend to strengthen government stockpile function and implement measures to stabilize supply demand so that the ripple effects on domestic market caused by the external risk is minimized. Let me stop here. Thank you, Glenn. Over to you.
Thanks, Byung-Sat. Appreciate that. And let's go and find out from Ton Chang how Vietnam was looking at this as well. A lot of risks out there. Governments trying to contain the fallout from many events that are not within their control. What does it look like from Hanoi?
Thank you. I think, yes, the concern of the inflation in Vietnam is very big now. We specify that the most of the reason for the higher inflation in very near future is because of the production cost increases. It causes by the supply chain disruption, and it causes by the energy price increases so much, and that's directly affect the production of the firms in Vietnam. And to cope with that, actually Vietnam do not have a very large monetary supply during the COVID times, and we do not concern much about the inflation increases by the monetary supply actually, but the most concern is how to reduce the cost for the production. The Vietnamese government already, I think for at least 1 month so far, we reduce the tax. I mean the fiscal policy in that sense. For the environment tax in the gasoline, we reduce about more or less from 7 to 10% of that. 50% of the tax actually, and it share about 10% of the retail price of gasoline. So we try to reduce that. That's the first attempt of the government to cope with the higher inflation. And the second point is we also try to reduce the VAT tax for that case. We hope that will support the enterprise to cope with the increasing production costs from international environment. And I think Vietnamese government now also try to push up the business cycle or try to increase the monetary velocity, so that it will have to lower the increase of the price very much. And you also support provide some support for people those are vulnerable with the higher price through the supporting program for the people. It share quite a lot, but like I mentioned before, it depends on the implementation or the disbursement of that kind of support to the people. So a lot of instrument actually so far we try to control for that kind of impact from the inflation. Another source of inflation in Vietnam is from internal. For example, the real estate price increased so much, and that's why the government now have some administrative solution to try to control for the real estate price. Then that's also have to reduce the inflation. I think the most concern right now is that kind of story. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ton Tong. Byung-Suk, I know that you have to leave just a few minutes early, but before you leave, there was one question for you about telemedicine and how does Korea make telemedicine more inclusive? Would you care to tackle that question before you have to jump on to another call?
No, thank you so much. Yes, actually, I anticipated that question because it's very interesting in person. Actually, there was a special argument regarding this the telemedicine introduction because the medical industry really does not want this introduction of telemedicine and remote medical treatments for their interest, I think. But due to this COVID-19, it's a really great opportunity for our lawmakers to look into this possibility. And therefore, there's an effort to introduce a new industry. Actually, because of this COVID-19, without this COVID-19, I think this movement would not happen in Korea. Therefore, I think since people feel comfortable about having this service remotely, therefore they will support this revise of law. Therefore, in near future, we expect that Korea would introduce this telemedicine or remote medical treatments. It will happen. I really appreciate COVID-19, especially because of this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, Korea has the technology to handle it. I guess culture and other factors have to come into play to make sure that it is ultimately utilized by the public. So thank you for your comments on that, Byung-Suk, and thank you for joining us today. I know you're going to be jumping off here in just a minute. Let's carry on, though, with our questions. Ling Hui, AMRO's report highlighted the importance of inter-regional risks and links, rather, especially with the post-pandemic recovery. With global supply chains being reconfigured, what can ASEAN economies do to increase their attractiveness as production bases for global or regional value chains? A lot of countries in the region now are looking at and have been looking at this exact question based on what's going on with our global supply chains. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, indeed, the supply chain disruptions that were brought about by the pandemic have renewed calls for reshoring, nearshoring, regionalizing production and supply networks. And in our latest ARIO report, we do find that reshoring and nearshoring intentions have gained some traction over the past year. But we think it's really unlikely that a significant share of global supply chains will be reconfigured away from the ASEAN+3 region. First, obviously, reshoring does not completely foreclose supply chain risks, right? In our report, we note that supply chain resilience is more likely to come from greater diversification of suppliers across more economies. And a similar view has been echoed by others, including the IMF. Secondly, the ASEAN+3 region is home to large consumer markets, and companies that want to tap into these markets would have very little incentive to relocate their production out of the region. And thirdly, the global value chains in the region are pretty well established. They've been built and fortified over decades, and they would be pretty costly and complex to fully reconfigure. Furthermore, I would say the key factors that make the region highly attractive as a production base are still in place, right? These are low labor costs, a good infrastructure, attractive FDI incentives, and business-friendly regulations. And importantly, the region has strong capabilities in high-tech manufacturing. And here I'm a little more positive than our colleagues in the ADB. I think that the region's high-tech capabilities actually have yet to be matched by other regions in the world. So there is an advantage there. And in fact, the pandemic has presented an opportunity for ASEAN+3 economies to enhance and upgrade their participation in global value chains because of this. One upside of the pandemic, obviously, is that it has accelerated the adoption of new technologies. We've all talked about this in this webinar. And many of these technologies have direct applications to global supply chains. So for example, blockchain technology, AI and big data, 3D printing, fintech for supply chain financing, just to name a few. So ASEAN+3 economies should really take advantage of these new technologies to climb up the value chain. Obviously, they will need to train and upskill their labor force in order to take advantage of these trends. Finally, our report also highlights the promise of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, and Marty mentioned this in her presentation. You know, as she mentioned, the RCEP provides low to zero tariffs, harmonized trade requirements, accommodating rules of origin within the entire ASEAN+3, plus Australia and New Zealand. So this is going to make it easier for multinational enterprises to use the comparative advantages of the different production bases in the region to serve the demands of the region and beyond. So really the launch of the RCEP at the start of this year, I think, has come at an opportune time for the region as it's seeking to recover from the pandemic and to shore up the supply chains. But the RCEP, of course, is not a magic bullet, right? So the ASEAN+3 economies will have to also do their part. They would have to make the most of the agreement by adhering to its rules and its commitments and disciplines in order to make it work and take full advantage of it. So just that's where I'm going to stop, but I just want to give a little shout out to a blog that Marty's going to be putting out pretty soon on the RCEP. So if you want to hear, if you want to read a little bit more about it, that would also be a good place to go.
Thank you, Ling Hui. Appreciate that. And let's stay with that RCEP theme. Lele Song, do we see a significant impact in the economic performance if ASEAN+3 countries deferred their RCEP ratification? And should that RCEP ratification be part of what you might consider a recommendation to these countries to help boost some of their sectoral growth? What do you think about how RCEP fits in these days?
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, I think RCEP is extremely important. Yeah, and I think probably I agree with Dr. Tan's assessment about ASEAN+3, but let me highlight why I say RCEP is extremely important. ASEAN Economic Community actually was set up in 2015. So until now, it's already 7-8 years now. But yet the ASEAN market still probably have some issues, some gaps. Let me highlight one gap. This is extremely important for the future. So the number of unicorns, I think ASEAN probably has about a dozen or maybe less unicorns. India, this may actually across 100 unicorns. India is about twice the population of ASEAN. And India's average income level is lower than average income level in ASEAN. So it's telling. And the future, the projected growth would rely on technology. And the tech race is ongoing. And it will be more important in the future. I just, in my first intervention, I highlight two technology revolution, digital as well as green. And these are extremely important. And I think ASEAN has many things to do, and RCEP can have an impact to make ASEAN to be more unified markets, to attract talents, to attract technology, and then to encourage innovation, entrepreneurship, and also a lot of policy issues. So basically, you would like to encourage tech startups, and then this would decide the future of all these economies. So I just stop here. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you. And Totang, can we just ask you real quickly your perceptions about RCEP as well as it relates to Vietnam? Is it something that Vietnam can take advantage of RCEP, especially given the accommodative monetary policy that you are seeing in other countries? Some of your brief comments on that, please. If you can unmute, please. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, for ASEP, I have a similar point of view with your previous speaker. Only one point I should note here is the rule of origin in the ASEP, with the cumulative rule of origin in the ASEP will reshape the supply chain or the value chain, production value chain in the ASEP very much, very much. From the Vietnamese perspective, we do not expect very much from the tax or the tariff reduction, because the ASEP is based on the ASEAN+3 FTA. So we do not think we will gain very much from that kind of tax reduction, but we very much expect about the restructure of the global value, regional value chain or the supply chain, where you can export to some ASEP, with though we can enjoy the benefit, the preference tariff from ASEP. Furthermore, we export to Japan with the preference tariff from the input we import from China, for example. But however, that's also the most of the concern in Vietnam, because it affects to the domestic industry. The Vietnamese government have a program to push up the supporting industry, but with the ASEP, the import price will be quite reduced, and it also stimulates the FDI firm in Vietnam to use import material rather than to use domestic suppliers. And that's a much concern. When in the output market, Vietnam export to ASEAN, and within the ASEAN countries not very large compared with our market in US or in the EU, because we have a EV already, and we wish to explore the benefit from that kind of FTA very much. But within the ASEAN, that's what I say is yes, for short term, yes, we can benefit somehow. But for long term, the much concern of the restructuring of the production linkage or the global value chain in the region is very, very, very big concern. Yeah.
Glenn,
I can hear.
You're muted, Glenn.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I double clicked it. I clicked on and then it clicked off again. My apologies. James, let's go to you. James Villafuerte at the ADB for our last question. Unfortunately, it's got to be a bit of a quick one so we can keep to time, James. But let's talk about digital literacy and how a country's digital literacy gap can be met, especially with the 2 years of that we're 2 years past the pandemic now. What are countries doing in that regard? Because many of them have changed quite markedly over the past 2 years.
Correct. Digital literacy is very important because this is one of the leg on which digital divide exists. The most important thing for digital literacy is actually first is providing access to smart devices for both kids, especially in the schooling age, as well as for workers. The second is also rolling out the new modes of learning, especially online learning, even for training. I think this is critical. But more importantly, I think a precursor for this widespread digital schooling is also a very strong internet access, which needs more investment in terms of telecoms. I'll stop there, Glenn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And we have come to the end of our webinar, and being mindful of everyone's valuable time and schedule, especially on a Friday afternoon, we do want to keep to time. But thank you very much. We want to thank Marty, James, Byung-sik, Totang, Lele, Ling Hui for your insights. It was a really fascinating moment today to have all of you on with us, and we do appreciate it. I would encourage all of you to visit the ADB and the AMRO websites to download and read the respective publications that we've been talking about today, and many other publications too that will give you great insight on what's happening in and across the region. I believe we're going to be getting a couple of QR codes coming up on the screen here in just a moment. Look for that perhaps just at the end of the webinar. In the meantime, thanks to all of you for watching today and for your participation, your questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we do appreciate the time and the comments that you had. I'm Glenn Van Zutphen. We hope to see you at our next event. Please have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, Ling Wei. Thanks, Marty.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank
James.
you, Lele.
Thank you,
Thank
Marty.
you.
Thanks,
Thank
thanks,
you, ADB
Glenn.
colleagues and Glenn.
Yeah, very well moderated.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So long, everybody.
So see you soon, Glenn.